Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Yates, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan and the student lead for the basketball analytics panel. We're very excited today. We have a distinguished panel of guests. Starting over here, we have John Hollinger from ESPN, Mike Zarin from the Boston Celtics, Jeff Van Gundy from ESPN, Dean Oliver, also from ESPN, and our moderator will be Jackie McMullen, also from ESPN.
I'd like to announce I've just been hired by, no, I'm just kidding, ESPN.
Mark Cuban is not able to make it today, but rest assured he'll be here tomorrow, and we're very excited to have him. A few logistics for the panel. We'll end the panel at 3:20, and we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer at the end. If you want to ask any questions to the panelists, you can text ASK1, ASK1, to 37048. Or you can tweet with the hashtag SSAC at any time during the panel. So with that, I will turn it over to Jackie.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Sorry I'm not Mark Cuban. We're all sorry we're not Mark Cuban.
Yes, exactly.
In so many ways
On
we can't
multiple
discuss.
levels, yes.
But I think we're going to have a great discussion anyway. So see this little thing here? Can you see this? I know it's hard to see. So this was on our table last night at dinner. And there's little lines. I don't know, Daryl, are you here? See? Okay. So this is there's little lines here, breaking off this little thing here. So I picked it up, and I said to people at my table, well, what is this? And somebody said, well, it's normal distribution. Someone else said it's a bell curve. And I hate to say this, Jess Gelman, are you here? Because she actually said it's a plush toy, which it sort of is. But the reason I'm holding this up, I think, is because actually Daryl's wife, who's very smart, explained to me that this is really a distribution of players in the NBA. So LeBron James would be over here, and the majority of the NBA players would fall here. How am I doing, Mike?
So far, so good.
So far. And so here it would be Semi Ardan or someone who's not getting a lot of playing time. I love Semi. He was a nice young man. But I'm just trying to make my point.
Semi's awesome.
Okay. But the reason I hold this up is because what I'd like to start with is the idea of how many of us all view analytics differently. That's really what I'm trying to get at. A lot of people, including the coach of the Houston Rockets at times, would call this a plush toy, wouldn't he, Daryl? He's smart, but he's not always interested in this. And he should be, and I think he's going to be as we go on. So I really want to start there. And I'm sorry Mark isn't here, because I think it was a big win for analytics that the Dallas Mavericks won the NBA championship, because they made some key changes during the course of the playoffs. So in the absence of Mark, John, let's start with you. They made some lineup changes that turned things around, and tell us about that and why that was so significant.
Well, for those who don't know, the Mavericks hired Roland Beach, the founder of 82games.com, and actually had him on the bench for all last season and the season before. And using some of that lineup data, they realized they were a lot better off with J.J. Barea starting, which is what they did the last 3 games. And that was kind of a key adjustment that helped them win that series.
Right. So, Dean, when they did that, that's a short-term, there's short-term data there, right?
Oh, yeah, you can't, a lot of lineup data, in fact, is not as reliable as you would like it to be. It tends to be noisy. So it's one piece of information among several others. Certainly, the Mavericks were also having a difficulty getting to the basket, and one of their best options for doing that was Barea himself. So it is a number of different pieces of information to make a decision. On top of, there is the coach knowledge of what their players really can do for them in these kind of situations.
So, Jeff, you've been an NBA coach for a long, long time. You've dealt with teams that are analytics mean something to them. How valuable were they to you, and were there some pieces of it that you had to resist?
Well, I think they're very valuable. I think the bigger question is not the knowledge that you get from them. It's what you feel comfortable in sharing with your team and how you're going to implement it with your team. For instance, 2-for-1 is a big question in the NBA, and
right.
Every analytic would say, without question. And I remember asking Daryl once, I don't know if I'm exactly right on this, but I said, if we shot 2-for-1 every time, how many wins would that translate into? And he said 1 every 2 years. And
Wow.
I think the thing you have to weigh that against is you try to establish a culture of unselfishness. So if you're taking 2 or 3 bad shots a game, does that start to break down other areas in your team? And also, what if a guy's 0 for 3 and you're asking him to come down and shoot the pull-up 28-footer to shoot by 30 or 32, whatever your breakoff is? Does that have a negative impact on him, the rest of the game? I think there's more issues involved than just the knowledge. So, but I thought the knowledge that Daryl brought was tremendous, and I think it helped me as a coach because it narrowed down some things that I thought about. And you could go to him with questions. If 2 for 1 is good, then why isn't 3 for 2 good or 4 for 3 good? And you could keep extrapolating it out.
You should just jack at the start of the game.
Yeah, So no, but I just think, yeah. So anyway, there was a lot I found was very good, and I'm not smart enough to actually do it or understand the math, but I can, when they give me the information, I thought, some of it was really helped me as a coach be better.
So Mike, the role of the coach in analytics, I assume is fairly critical. He's got to be open-minded. He's got to be interested. You can show him data that succeeds, and that would make any coach excited, I would think, because it's going to make your team better. But how involved I assume they don't have to gather the data. They get the data, but then how do you get them to?
Sure. Well, it varies depending on the kind of question you're talking about. So sort of what Jeff was getting at, I think, is, there's 20 things in his head that will get us X number of wins per season, and you can only focus on 6 of them in practice, and the players might remember 4 and actually execute 1 in a game. And so you have to, you got to pick your battles, sort of, if you're a stats guy who shows up and needs to go talk to a coach. But if you're a coach, you have to pick your battles too.
Sure.
And so there's a bunch of battle selections that happen, right? But the other thing is, it really depends on the kind of question you're asking. So during the regular season, we have a lot of automated stuff that we've created, a whole system of reports that the coaches just get what they want. And I'm not really involved in a lot of that stuff at all, because on a night-to-night basis, you just don't make many adjustments during the regular season. You want to get better at the stuff you're doing. The games come too fast to completely change what you're doing for the next opponent. During the playoffs, it's very different.
Sure.
Then you can do all sorts of analyses on very specific questions about very specific opponent tendencies. And there, the questions tend to be less automatable, for lack of a better term. And so,
Which is what Dallas did.
right. So
finals.
Exactly. I don't, Roland doesn't go around telling me what he's doing on the bench for Dallas, obviously. I'm not like the last person he wants to tell, but he does all sorts of stuff during the regular season. My guess is his impact is greater during the playoffs.
Well, that would make sense. You have practice, which you hardly ever have during the
This year
regular
we got
season.
like no practice.
Yeah.
0, right. It's very difficult for the media. Not that anybody cares about that, but there's never a practice anymore. And also, I would think, too, you're playing the same opponent over a period of days, so you actually have some consistent data that would go.
Yeah, and I imagine they looked at not just in general how they do with J.J. Barea playing, but also specifically how they're doing against specific Heat lineups and
Correct.
who they're like, they know they're going to be facing that team. There isn't some other team afterwards that someone else needs to be worried about. So it's easy to focus all your energies then.
So I mentioned this to you, Mike, that last night at our dinner, I had Rondo as a big topic of conversation here, obviously, in the Boston area, and some rumored trade talks. And as I was walking through the building, people were asking me, and one gentleman said to me, well, they really should trade Rondo because all my numbers tell me is they're a lot worse off when he's on the floor. The numbers are better when he's not playing. And then within an instant, another gentleman over my shoulder said, well, my analytics tell me the exact opposite. So I guess my question is, the data is one thing, how you implement it or analyze it is quite another. Is that not true?
Well, there's 2 kinds of, Dean actually, I think, sort of
All right,
made
Dean,
a-
you
He's,
answer.
he's trying to pass
I'm
off
gonna
on the
answer
Rondo
I'm just-
question.
He said something a couple years ago, which is kind of smart, I thought. And there's counting things, and then there's analyzing the things that you count, or something to that effect.
Yes.
And my favorite thing is when someone in the media says, well, the stats say X. Because there's no the stats. right? I mean, there's a bunch of different things that you could look at. And so some of them will tell you one thing and others will tell you something different. And both of those people might have very good reasons for saying what they're saying, and they each
Yeah,
might
they're
not
both
be
smart people, I'm sure.
considering some of the things that the other person's considering. So, you know, a lot of the work that I do ends up being trying to figure out what I'm not saying or what I should know I'm not able to say, so that you can communicate that. So we say, all right, let's say you pick a player, we'll just pick some random player.
Like Rondo.
And you look at, okay, so but you look at when he's on the court and when he's off the court, and it turns out that our team scores more when he's on the court. Well, he's playing with a bunch of other players,
Right.
and he might have been out some games during which we were playing opponents of better or worse
Correct.
skill, and there's a bunch of other things that come into play with that. So then, you've got a bunch of, if you're a decent analyst, you have some skills and you know some modern science and you can use some techniques to sort of fish those things out, so you're left with something else. But those techniques all have flaws. And so you got to know, all right, you know, I'm doing a regression on something. What are the issues with regression?
So
And somehow you have to communicate that to the coach without using the word regression, because that's a disaster.
Or the coach could just use his eyes and know that the one guy you talk to is a moron, and they're better with Rondo on the court than Avery Bradley.
yeah.
That could actually be a solution too. You know, so
What I said a couple
That's
years
why you're
ago.
on this panel, Jeff.
those aren't the hard ones, believe me. There's many hard coaching decisions.
Yeah, I mean,
That's not one.
Avery's good too, though.
He's good. No, he's good. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying you don't have to be a genius to figure that one out.
And really what Mike didn't say is you're trying to make a decision. It's not necessarily about whether Rondo's good or less good or anything like that. It was, okay, what are you going to do? What's the alternative here too? So the decision is what you have to analyze. You can spend all sorts of time, and people do this, trying to identify a metric for better evaluating players. But that's only part of a decision a lot of times. Sometimes the decision is just making sure that you're confident that whoever you're replacing Rondo with is going to make the team better. Because it's not that Rondo's replacement is better.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Is the team going to be better? And you've got to frame those questions the right way, or you will get the wrong answer, and you'll piss off Jeff.
Right. I've actually heard this before, and I think, Mike, I've heard you say this, that you don't rank players. You don't bother with that.
No,
right?
that's like Dean's new job, not his old job, right? I mean,
No.
we don't sit around, and there isn't time this year to sit around and say, geez, who's better, Tim Duncan or Kevin Garnett? You just don't.
Who is? No, just kidding. Kidding.
But it's just, those aren't the questions you face when you work for a team. It's very rare. Now, sometimes you're making a one-for-one trade at the same position and guys are very similar, but that's so rare that happens.
Right.
You don't see a lot of those trades.
So, John, you spend a lot of time trying to analyze this data, some that you have access to, some that you don't. And I wonder when you do it, if you have to, I always think whenever you're rating a player, you have to take into account statistics, but then there's chemistry in the locker room, his salary cap hit, you know, how it affects the team financially. How hard does it make for you to do your job when you have to factor in all those things as well?
Well, it's where it gets to be more art than science. You know, getting to what you're talking about earlier, there's the old statement, if you torture a number badly enough, it will tell you anything. And you can find a number to support any point of view if you look hard enough. But it's looking across all it's looking at all the data and all those things you mentioned, and knowing, for example, I mean, in a salary cap league, salary is a huge factor that you have to account for as well. And then there's all the things that we don't really have good numbers for. My player efficiency number, it works for what it rates, but it can't see most of defense, for instance. And so you have to factor that in somehow.
But we're getting new information on things like that. So now
This is true.
Now there's
Yeah.
10 arenas where we've got cameras in the rafters that are actually tracking the player's location at 25 frames a second.
Right.
At X and Y, and the ball X, Y, and Z.
Sport
And
view.
Sport View is what they call it, yeah.
But then you have to know what to do with it. Because
Right, so
this
that's,
is an
you
immense
should see the
amount of
files you
information.
get from this thing. It's just row after row of X, Y position.
Well, I actually
the Matrix.
did a little research on SportView because I know your team is using it and Golden State, I believe, is using it. Interestingly not, Dallas is not using it, or at least not according to my records. Houston's using it.
They were.
Yeah,
Okay,
Dallas
they
used
were.
it last year.
Okay, and why are they not anymore? Do we know?
We don't know.
Okay. Ooh, I bet there's some intrigue there.
There
Ask
are
Mark
I
Cuban
wanna say
tomorrow,
there's arena
somebody, when you
issues
see
with a
him.
couple
But what they're doing, so you understand what we're speaking about, is SportView installs, is it 6 cameras?
3 on each end.
All right, throughout the arena, and they're trying to figure out speed, distance, player separation, ball possession data.
Well, so you get the information on where everyone's located. And then what you do with it is they provide some things, but what you do with it is up to you. One thing that nobody's had until recently, unless you went and watched every game and counted, which there have been services that would do that for you, is something like who passes to whom. Sorry, when these guys are on the floor together, maybe he never passes to him.
Right.
That's a problem.
It's the girlfriend thing.
Right,
probably.
exactly.
Yeah.
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite. He only passes to this
I wonder
guy.
if he has stats from Steve Francis and Coutinho Mobley.
You know what? I actually,
The system wasn't installed.
That was your next question?
I pulled one out, actually,
Okay.
that I thought was kind of interesting, Kevin Durant. And what they charted over a period of time was what Kevin Durant's shooting percentage was based on how many dribbles he took. So when Kevin Durant has 0 dribbles, he shoots 55% from the floor. 1 to 2 dribbles, he shoots 58% from the floor. So here's where it gets interesting. 3 to 4 dribbles, 39% from the floor. 5 or over dribbles, 40% from the floor. So we're all pretty smart. What that tells us is that he should really only dribble once or twice.
Right.
Is that
I mean,
how
it's,
you
of course,
use it?
it's not that simple.
Except-
It's based on, again, situations, double teams, so on and so forth. But that's just a little taste of what SportView
Would
does.
you use that?
I wouldn't tell a guy you're 38% on 3 to 4 dribbles, so dribble the 5th time because you go up to 40. So, you know, you better be pretty sure about what you're saying. It makes sense that, you know, you get some layups off no dribbles, you know, or on a fast break, the ball's kicked ahead and 1 dribble layup. So I'm sure there's other things that you could figure out about that, but listen, I would come in after a film, and if I watched a game and I saw what I wanted to change, and then I would either use numbers that support it, or I would make them up. Because the players are not going to know the difference. And so if I thought Durant was over dribbling,
Now they will.
if I thought Durant was over dribbling, I would, you know, if I was coaching him, I would say, you know, I might give him that, and I might have made it up too. So, you know,
So
but
how do the players respond to this kind of information? Do they get overload? Do they glaze
that's why
over?
you're not going to sit there and like have a board like that. You know, you're going to talk to them about like
Too many sports.
real things.
Right.
That, you know, because the coaches sometimes aren't the brightest bulbs like myself, and then, you know, you want players to feel confident. You don't want them out there sometimes saying, you know, was that 2 dribbles or 3 when I pulled up?
Right.
You know, I mean, some of it is a feel, but over time, something that's a little too general for me, but you know, you can use and or make up however you see fit.
So, but you're going to use statistics in 2 different ways if you're a coach, right? One is to figure stuff out. You want to know something about your team. And then the other one is as a communicative tool. And those 2 things are completely different. You know, the coaches will come to me sometimes and say, how good are we when we do this? You know, or this. And the only reason they want to know is because they think we suck at it, whatever it is, and they need something that they can tell the players that's not just, I think we suck at this. They want to say, gee, of the last 49 times we did this, 36 we didn't score.
Just tell Doc to make it up.
So,
Jeff
well,
says it's
sometimes
okay.
he does, but
Every
other times
coach
he actually,
does. That's not me.
Other times, then he can blame me, when they do something else, and it's. But the other thing is that data can really be misused too, right? So maybe if you got rid of the catch and shoot situations, it turns out he's better when he dribbles more,
Right.
right?
That's-
So
I mean,
there's
that's
all
what I
sorts
think
of
Jeff
there's
is
all sorts of issues with that.
Yeah, that was a simple number. And sometimes if you tell a coach a simple number and it supports their point, they'll be glad to use it. If it's a simple number and they have a question, as you were talking about, and as Mike just hinted at, if you do take out those catch and shoots, then maybe everything balances out. And it's a tough line for these guys to walk sometimes.
Right. Well, the other thing is there's other ways to use these kinds of data. Too. Like these are very sort of, when you think about basketball statistics, that's the kind of thing you think about. What's your field goal percentage in situation
Right,
X?
sure.
But another piece of data is how far does the player run during the game? The strength and conditioning coaches might be pretty interested in training them to run that
Right.
distance.
So that's what those cameras are for.
I mean, you could do a bunch of things like that. At the end of every Premier League game, they put a thing on the screen. If you go to the soccer analytics panel later, they'll probably talk about this, or maybe not, that says how far everyone ran, who ran the most. That's like a mysterious thing to most basketball people, but now we know.
Very good. Okay, so we can't get through any panel in this entire weekend without talking about Jeremy Lin, so I guess this is the best time to jump in here. Jeff, I'm curious. I don't even know where to start with Jeremy Lin, other than it's an incredibly wonderful story, and I think there's a lot of Jeremy Lins out there. That's my own opinion. That because of circumstance, because there's 2 point guards ahead of him that are on guaranteed contracts that the owner doesn't want to eat, or any kind of circumstances, that there are players like that out there that we will never find out about. So I'm just curious of your impression.
I wouldn't agree with that.
You don't agree with that?
No, I think a lot of guys can put up numbers. If you're on a roster, if given opportunity and minutes, you can put up numbers, but you can't win.
Okay.
So I think the incredible part of the story, and I think everybody has to realize, we're not even through chapter 1
No, of
of
course
the
we're not.
Jeremy Lin story.
Well,
so,
there's no point even talking about his analytics. He doesn't have any yet, does he?
well,
really?
but people are there set to blame, people who didn't play him, or, there's so many factors that go into it. And evaluating a player, anybody who says they know now that he will continue to be a starting level player for a championship level team, or he can't do that, I think is mistaken. It will play out over time. But, and I think this year in particular, there wasn't much practice time to be able to analyze somebody. So I don't think there are a lot of guys that are doing what he could do, which is put up these huge numbers while winning an incredible percentage over what they were winning. Particularly when you think about it, when he was doing it with a starting lineup of Fields, Walker, Jeffries, and Chandler. I think that incredible job by him.
John?
To me, it's what Lin shows is that outliers are always going to happen, and no matter how good your predictive models are or whatever, there are always going to be people that for whatever reason are going to defy or exceed it, or you can't always map improvement by a player. It's not always these nice even increments. Sometimes guys shoot up or shoot down, and it's a very difficult thing to model for that reason.
I agree with a lot of what Jeff said. I think we don't know, the book is not even close to being written on him, but it is interesting.
It's coming out like next week, right? There's some
Oh,
book
God.
coming out.
Probably right. I think I did look to see how many guys, before he got his first start, who had performed as well as he had this year in as roughly 50 minutes, which is I think what he had. And there really aren't guys who performed in those 50 minutes in any 50 minutes as well as he did. So it gives you some inclination to say, well, maybe he is better. He certainly looked better than just a guy you could ignore. But it certainly doesn't mean that he's anything. We're not sure that he's a starting point guard on a good team.
Well, and isn't he playing for the perfect coach for the style of his team, too?
Certainly his style has changed from what he was in Golden State. He was
Right.
much more passive, and it looks like Coach D'Antoni basically said, look, we're playing terribly at the point guard position. Go out, be who you are, do as much as you need to do, make mistakes. It's not going to matter. And in that way, I think it's helped, plus the general system of having the wing shooters and such like that.
Yeah,
really has
Novak's
him.
helped him a lot, sure.
Absolutely.
Right.
And they've been playing some bad teams.
The schedule has
That
not
always
been the hardest.
that's always
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
that always helps. I always find when you play a bad team,
It helps.
your stuff looks not just a player, but as a coach, you can't evaluate your whatever you want to call it, a system, which I think your players are your system, but you can't evaluate what you're doing against the bad teams. You have to try to evaluate it against, the best teams. And so that's why I think, and we all work except for Mike for ESPN, who bludgeoned you with Jeremy Lin and his, quote, struggle. And that's the other thing that drives me crazy about the media. What do you mean his struggle? Struggle compared to who? Minor league baseball players were in the minors for 10 years to get one at bat. John Lucas Jr. with the Bulls has had a bigger, this idea that he struggled. He was in the NBA last year.
Yeah.
Just because you didn't get to play right away, there's a lot of guys who don't get to play right away. So sometimes I think we're missing what a great story it is because we're trying to make it a different story. This guy, doesn't matter where he went to college. It doesn't matter what his religion is. It doesn't matter, that he was in the D League twice or whatever it was. What matters is that this guy can play. He got an opportunity. He took advantage of it. He's helping his team win. And just let the story breathe a little bit instead of make it up.
I
You
do
work for
think
the
there's
wrong
something
company,
to your
Jeff, for that.
No, that's what
I do think there's something to Jackie's point, though, which is there are players in the NBA who, if given an opportunity to do the thing that they're best at, would be seen as better players. They just don't get a chance because of a bunch of circumstances. They go from team to team, and the situation's just there's Kevin Garnett in front of them or someone, and they don't get to play. If Shumpert hadn't gotten hurt, who knows what would have happened in the Jeremy Lin situation.
And the example of that
we claimed him, actually. Who knows if he would even gotten to play if we'd gotten him? I don't know.
But I was going to say the example of that isn't Lin, it's Novak.
Right.
On the Knicks, because he's actually the guy who's been placed in. I don't think he's a different player than he was on those other teams, but he's been placed in the perfect role for him.
Right, we've got a history of those players.
Well, I was his first coach. I started him his first game, and I vowed after those first 24 minutes, he was never, ever going to be on the floor. No, I mean, not that. But I started him his first game. As a rookie, we started him his first game because, I thought we needed to spread the floor, right, at the 4. And Carlos Boozer in 24 minutes back when he was like
Carlos
still
Boozer.
Really athletic. It just was hard for him as a young player. It was hard for him. And so what I reflect back on, as I started him in another game in Phoenix, and Daryl was always on me to play him, right? And so he made a 3, but I played him at the 3, and I've never seen a father couldn't be more proud than they showed Novak making the shot in the left corner, and behind our bench, Daryl jumping up and down like his first son was born. But my point is that we'd always thought of him as as a 4, but you know what? It's interesting. They're playing him a lot at the 3, and I never thought he could guard those guys, but he's actually doing better against those guys than the bigger, stronger guys.
yeah.
So it's very interesting, my mistake was I knew he could shoot. He played very well in that preseason, but I think I went back to what Mike said. I just thought we had, whether I was right or wrong, better players that gave us a better chance to win. So it's interesting.
Guys aren't static either. I mean, you become a better player over time. Jeremy Lin didn't shoot this well as he's shooting now in college.
But I think Novak would have shot that well.
No, right.
I do. I don't think he could have defended that
right,
well.
but that's what I'm talking about.
I don't think he could
People
have helped
get better
us
at the
win.
things.
Right, yeah.
But so much of it is, I think, remember, Bruce Bowen was a Celtic once, and I covered the team back then, and he was just, they liked him, but he didn't have the skill set they needed at that point where their team was. They weren't contenders. He goes to San Antonio. They retired his number, which I thought was an incredibly great thing to do. It's the first time I can ever remember a defensive player's number being retired for doing the right things on the defensive end of the floor. It just made sense for him in that setting. Statistically,
I think what made sense for him there was he was always a great defender.
Always.
Okay,
He learned
but
to shoot threes.
he got to the corner 3. Plus, they had people that always brought the second person to the ball, whether it was Duncan in the post or
Right.
Parker and Ginobili. So he was always open.
Right.
You weren't going to double. I forgot when he played here. I coached against him, but Ron Mercer.
No, exactly.
you weren't
but that's
doubling
exactly
Ron
my
Mercer.
point. You become a much better player when you're out there with Ginobili and Tim Duncan.
Yeah.
All of us. So I want to talk about, too, a little, if I can, to get you guys to talk about impact numbers, crunch time versus the rest of the game, if we can. I always call them the Armin Gilliam numbers, who I love, God rest his soul. But he was one of those guys that would drop 20 on you, but usually 17 of them in the first half.
Right.
So maybe you could break those. That's a pretty important distinction, isn't it?
It can be. It depends on what you're looking at. If you're trying to make forecasts of the future over a longer period of time, I don't think that shows a lot of it. But over the course of managing a series or managing games, some of that can be very helpful because it sheds some light on mentality. But over the longer period of time, there's not necessarily a lot in there to win an extra few games over the course of the regular season. Those get blended in with everything else that they do. So I don't use a lot of crunch time numbers for trade evaluation. Certainly it's not something that goes into a lot of draft preparation, those kind of things.
Because it's a big deal among the players. They talk in the locker room about it all the time. Well, Melo has the best shooting percentage with 2 minutes left in the game. So, John, what does your data tell you?
Well, I mean, Melo, if you look at his crunch time stats, I mean, he's right up there depending on how you slice it. You know, there's no accepted definition of crunch time yet, really. I mean, you know, are you doing within 3 points, within 5 points, 2 minutes, 5 minutes? But yeah, Melo's up there no matter how you look at it. The problem with most crunch time data, especially when you're looking at one season, is that you're looking at such small slices of data that random noise is going to blow away anything you could determine as an actual skill. So you really need to look at multi-year data to have anything even remotely convincing as far as making conclusions other than, you know, especially like predictive conclusions. Like, you know, you could say, well, this team has shot badly in clutch situations this year, but in terms of what does it mean, most of the time it's just going to be random noise. Sometimes there's a real issue there, but it's hard to factually prove that unless you've got a really big data set, because there's just not that many crunch time minutes in a season.
There's a bunch. Go ahead. There's a bunch of other things in basketball too. The game actually changes at the end of the game. So if you're comparing those possessions where there's inevitably a timeout and the defense is inevitably set up and it's inevitably some sort of either ISO or very specific drawn up play, that's not the same as your average run-of-the-mill possession. And so there's a bunch of other things you have to think about when looking at that. But one of the things that we find a lot is it's not that everybody's always talking about, well, who elevates their game when you know the game's really on the line. It's much less that and much more about who wilts.
That's interesting.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, guys don't tend to get better in those situations.
And so how do you measure that?
Well, you can look at a bunch of different things, right? Like you want to look at, the first thing you want to know is the team, right? So if the team is always good in those situations, however you're going to slice it, then there's probably someone on the team doing something worthwhile, whether it's the coach or the players. You might look at, you know, is it independent of, it doesn't matter who's on the court, the team's always better in those situations, then you might say it's something to do with the coach.
Right.
Other times, you know, you see a player move from team to team and they're always among the best in those situations, you might say, you know, that player's pretty good.
But what I think the way that it ends up getting used is I never gave our coaching staff any information on who would wilt or who would step up if there was such a thing in crunch time, because coach is going to know that. They know their team. But on the opposing team, a lot of times what they're looking at is, okay, a free throw percentage for the season or something, so that's who they're going to foul. But there might be information where you can say, actually, this guy shoots 75% normally, but in crunch time, that's the guy to foul because he feels the pressure. That's where that kind of information can
Right,
help.
because the other thing is, like, the fact that a guy shoots well in a certain game situation, if you define it by score and time, doesn't say anything about which shots it is that you're looking at on which he shot well. And
Well,
so
I think we
you
had a
better hope that you get the same, you know, if you got a guy who you say, well, this guy's 60% in this game situation, you better hope you're getting one of those shots that made up that 60%. Because if you're not, you know, it's something completely different and you're not really, that statistic is meaningless for what you're using it for.
Well, I don't know who we were discussing this with last night. They were talking about Miami last season and how at the end of games, a lot of time LeBron and D. Wade were taking the final shot, but they were shooting three-pointers when neither one of them shot a high percentage of three-pointers, and I think it's one of the biggest...
Except against us in that last series.
Yes, well, that and many other things, Michael. Sorry. But they don't shoot very many three-pointers this year, so clearly they made their own determination on that. Kobe Bryant makes a lot of game-winning shots, but his shooting percentage, I believe, on game-winning shots is particularly low, isn't it, John?
Where's Henry?
Where's Henry? Henry, we need to bring Henry up here. For
Or
this.
Alok has he did all that original work, and I think he went back and charted Michael Jordan's game-winning stuff too, if I remember
Similar?
correctly.
Was it
Yeah.
similar?
Well, I think Michael Jordan was better. So
I
Was
saw
better
that.
or worse?
Yeah, that doesn't.
better.
That Michael Jordan was pretty good. That's revolutionary science
Yeah.
right there.
exactly.
Yeah. But so I guess, again, I'll ask you, Jeff, as a coach, sometimes it's just, it's visual data, isn't it? You're a coach, you have a hunch, you know these players, you're in a situation, and how much of that, no matter what the numbers tell you, do you go with your gut?
Well, it's also, again, what's your best option?
Right.
First of all, I think what's overdone, I'm just thinking back, is taking timeouts to advance the ball to half court late. I think you may be better served just getting it and on the run, just forgetting your timeouts, because I'm not even sure how much time it really saves you. But I think you got to go with your best options, and it's about many things: that game, that matchup, what that team guards or doesn't guard well, and so I think sometimes to reduce the NBA game just to clutch. Listen, I think the game's as much a first quarter game as a fourth quarter game. I think so. You need some Gilliams if that's what you're saying. Give me some Gilliams, because I'd rather be up in there. What do you guys?
Be up
Plus
20,
5 or
yeah.
minus 5? Let me be the plus 5, and I'm going to feel a lot better about my chances, to close those games out. So, as people knock LeBron James about whatever is they want to knock him about now, I'm all in on him, okay? So give him to me, and we'll figure out the last 3 minutes, believe me.
I agree.
The point Jeff raises, though, is a perpetual one, and for any of you who want to do analytics, this will always be the argument back. Well, that's an average, and I know in this situation against this guy in this place, it's different. And that might be right. So how do you deal with that is a big question, and it's just a matter of what data you're using and what data you think they're using. That's...
And I just want to add one thing. It's like the gentleman you said with the Mavericks, Roland Beach, right?
Yes.
So if I always think credit and blame in a sport should be equal. Like, so whatever percentage you're going to accept in victory, you've got to be willing to accept the counterpart in defeat. So what happened the year before? He wasn't giving them good numbers? You know what I'm saying? I think every coach does their job. That's his job to give ideas. But this idea that, because I bet you Miami has analytics.
Oh, yeah. they
Okay,
do.
so I'm not going to say that Miami's analytic team was worse. Maybe Dallas played better. Maybe they knocked down 9 in the second quarter. They knocked in an incredible number of threes that Deshaun Stevenson maybe doesn't shoot as well. I mean, I think sometimes we reduce this great game that is inexplicable at times, like why things happen, and we try to give too much credit or too much blame. And I don't know, I think sometimes it can sap the fun out of it,
I hope
like
not.
I did.
I hope not. I hope not. Yeah.
So in terms of trades and using analytics for trades, it would seem to me it gets complicated because some teams have their own analytics, and some teams like San Antonio, I believe they still don't have any.
Oh, no, they're
Oh,
right
no.
there.
Antonio has
They're
it.
here
They got a bunch of people out here.
Okay.
Yes.
Anybody here from San Antonio?
Yeah.
They wouldn't
They're
reveal
back there.
themselves.
Okay,
Over
awesome.
there.
Yeah.
So, are you when you're talking with these people? Everybody has their own numbers, their own ideas. How does that complicate the dialogue, if at all?
Well, it's been very difficult to make trades with Daryl since he
Yes.
left us. He and I tend to think alike on things, so that part's hard. But I don't know what the other teams are doing or thinking. They don't tell me. We make a trade, and sometimes we're very excited to make the trade. We think we're getting back way more value than we're trading out. And there's someone on the other end of the phone who presumably thinks the same thing, or else they wouldn't be making the trade.
Yeah, that's the deal.
So I don't know what data, there's sort of two types of trades, right? One is you think player A is better than player B, but the other is
Salary
for your
dump
team. Well, so there's maybe three types. One's a financial type, and then the other type is they're just different needs. And so you can end up doing a trade where both teams are better off. That
Mutually
happens.
exclusive.
That's what you try to get, is you try to get the deals that, it's a lot easier to
They're
negotiate.
not looking
a
at
deal.
our team for whether or
Right.
not they should do that trade, and we're only looking at our team. I don't really, unless
Well,
I'm
I
making
would say actually you are looking at the other team so that you can kind of sell it to them. You are trying to
Sometimes.
sell that,
Yeah.
yes. I mean,
Figure
you
out what
take,
they need.
you
right.
take
But
our
my
guy,
point is
it
just
does help you.
it's not. I'm not trying to evaluate if it's a good trade for them. That's not what I spend
You're
most
trying
of
to
my
make-
time on.
you're trying to
We're trying to make
convince
our
them that-
team better.
yes,
I might,
exactly.
tell them, well, we actually do think this is going to make your team better. Hopefully, I'm not lying. Usually, I'm not.
Right.
Because you want to do the trade.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure what they're looking at. Usually, we're looking at what will make us a better team. And better is, the goal here is championship, so that's what better is.
Yeah, I mean, I think 90% of the time it's situational arbitrage. It's, we have an old team, you have a young team, you trade this vet, you shed this salary, and it changes the situations of both teams
Not
for
sure
the
what
better.
you're talking about.
And you can spend a lot of time looking at other teams' rosters to figure that out because you're not in everybody's head. You're not in 29 other general managers' heads every day. And you spend your 15 minutes sometimes just staring at their roster and trying to think, okay, what is Daryl thinking? Or what is Danny thinking? So that's what they want. And maybe there's something on our team that we can offer them that's going to make them happy and they'll give us something.
The best trade partners are the ones where you actually really understand on each side
Right.
what it is that they're looking for, and then you can work out a trade pretty easily. It's the really cagey teams, you don't really know what it is that they want, and so it's hard to look down your roster or your set of assets and figure out, all right, this will work, and maybe they're so cagey they don't propose it back to you, and you actually could have made a trade, but it doesn't happen.
There must be times when you hear about a trade or see a trade come across and you say, I wish they called me, I could have given them. Does that happen?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How often does that happen?
The Al Jefferson, Kevin Garnett. That's when it happens.
Thank you for saying that. Yes,
Come on.
Exactly.
That's one.
There wasn't
Can I
any
get in
team
on
in the
that?
league that didn't talk to Minnesota about that trade before it happened. Not one.
I'm just going to let that one
Worked
go.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wonder too, if you're playing it, let's say you're playing a team in the postseason and you're trying to compile data about that team. Do you ever run across a situation where they may skew that data because they maybe know coming up they're going to play you, so maybe they use different lineups, or perhaps they, I don't know, try to camouflage what it is they're really trying to do? Is that too specific?
Definitely
Yeah,
happens.
I've never seen that. What you do see in the playoffs is teams will, create new plays that you haven't seen before. And
What
so-
happens though?
No, I mean
have
in
seen-
advance of the playoffs.
I've seen it because San Antonio a couple years ago they sat all their guys right
I was
before
gonna
they
say
would
that,
play
yeah.
the team
Yeah.
they would play in the first round.
Yeah.
And so they didn't show anything.
Right.
They ran plays number 82 and 83. So they didn't run any of their normal
But
stuff.
I don't know about hiding something in the numbers. That's harder to do.
It is. Basically, if someone was naive and they tried to use the numbers from that game, okay, but hopefully they didn't do that. Yeah.
Fair enough. So going forward here, we've got the sport view, we've got things going. I wonder if there's a way now, and we do a lot of numbers with players. Have you thought about numbers with coaches, for instance? I don't know, John, if you've ever given any thought about trying to break down coaches and their tendencies and things like that.
Yeah, it can be really hard. I mean, there's definitely coaches who have tendencies. I mean, certainly if you look at Mike Fratello, I mean, his teams are going to play slower. If you look at Mike D'Antoni, his teams are going to be more offensive-minded. There's definitely tendencies that coaches exhibit. It's really hard to separate that out from the personnel, though, because coaches, most coaches haven't coached in so many places that you have 9 or 10 completely different data sets to work with. Larry Brown, sure, but everyone else, not really.
Bill Fitch, yeah.
Yeah. There are coaching analytics, and I think there is either a panel or a paper or something.
There's a panel coming up later.
That's coming up, and I think you can do some evaluation of coaching, but it's if you don't do it carefully, you end up with things that are reflective more of the players
Sure,
than of the
that makes
coaches.
sense.
And it is, and I would say it's not, again, with a lot of analytics, you don't want a single number. A lot of times you want to get a sense, okay, what kind of coach do we need for this roster, or do we want for this roster, and going forward. And there's different aspects of what you do as a coach. Sometimes it's building the young players that you've got. Sometimes it's working with vets who may be a little bit more difficult. Sometimes you want someone who's a little bit more solid on their X's and O's. And you want to be able to separate these components so that when you're managing the hire, you know what you're getting, and you can communicate clearly to them for what you want and what they can give you.
It's really, really difficult to evaluate the overall impact of a coach from a quantitative perspective, though, just because it's just so hard to divorce the coach from the players. You need just so much data, and even in the situations you're referring to, there isn't always enough. I mean, the guy's sometimes only there for a year.
Okay.
You got to get more data.
All right, so I'm going to read some of these questions that you have all tweeted in. And I'm going to hope I can read your handwriting. From J Gold 13, it looks like. I can't read this. Oh, if you had to give your opinion on basketball analytics in one word, this is for you, Mr. Van Gundy, what would it be?
One word. Enlightening.
Okay. From number 5 on Twitter, for coaches, I guess that's you again, Jeff. For what coaches, what analytics should you share with the players on your team?
Well, I don't even know what analytics means. Is that like deeper stats?
No, but
It's
I don't
enlightening.
either.
It's
Like I don't know what that
enlightening.
means. Huh? Like
It's
so,
enlightening.
like it depends on what point you want to make. So maybe we're being a bunch of mutts in a 3 or 4 game period where you're not happy with the effort, and it could be something as simple as our field goal defense is tops in the league overall last 4 games. We're down here. It could be something much more complicated, much more detailed, talking about like Yao in the post. Every post guy I've ever thought they were as effective at 8 feet as they were at 10 feet as they were at 12 feet. And so people were always trying to convince me, have Yao shoot more turnaround jump shots. Yeah, that's great. 7'6" guy shooting 15-footers, great. That's just what the other team wants, okay? So I would talk to him about at 4 feet with both feet in the paint, and Daryl had numbers, but I might have made them up or embellished, whatever. So, you're like this, and then to 6 feet, and then, because every step does matter in post play, and I think,
Right.
It can be stuff like that. It can be team wide. I think it certainly gives you an opportunity in one-on-one discussions as you're watching film with a guy to throw some things out that are factual and not just where they think you're picking on them. Because every player.
Or making it up.
Well, no, they don't catch on to making it up, but they think that, like you're just like they're, but Johnny isn't doing something else. Well, you're not talking about Johnny, we're talking about you, so it just gives you a little bit more weapons to try to correct what you want corrected.
It depends on the player too, though, because like Battier, you could tell like, hey Shane, this guy shoots 2 standard deviations below the league average when you force him to his left, and he can like take that information and like note it. How to process that a little better than some other guys.
Or, some other guys, you say, I can't say what I would say to them, but I would encourage them, can we get him going left, please?
That's what you end up doing with a lot of these. You say, look, we got to double team them. They suck when they're double teamed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Pretty
You don't say
basic.
what the number is.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, they understand that.
Yeah, you gotta, it depends on who
When I would prepare stuff for coaches, there were actually very few numbers in there.
Okay.
It
With
was
trends.
usually words, because I know that it was easier for them to absorb, and it was easier for them to communicate, and hopefully it was consistent with what they were already thinking. Whereas if they have to do the translation between the numbers and what they're thinking, it's harder and it can get confused and wrong. So.
Okay. Okay, this is from Ariel on Twitter, and this is for you, Mike. During the regular season, do GMs and to some degree coaches use analytic data for long-term macro issues, i.e. types of offense/defense?
So yeah, again, it's hard to say what analytics is. We'll track the plays we call, and if there's one that's not working, the coaches will know. And if there's a set of plays that aren't working, the coaches will know. So absolutely. The other thing you want to look at is your young players' development. Are there some trends that are useful? So yeah, I mean, that's sort of on the coaching side. On the front office side, I don't know what counts as a long-term something, but there's a lot of stuff that we do. All right, so analytics, right? What is it, right? We just try to get all the information we can that we think is useful to make every decision that we're making. And some of the decisions are really small. What should our subs, who should sub in now? Should you do the 2-for-1 or whatever? Other decisions are really big. What does a championship team look like? And so if there's information out there that'll help us answer those questions, we want it.
Fair enough. Okay, this is from Hoopism on Twitter. By the way, NBA teams, there are plenty of us programmers who would love to help you parse this wealth. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble reading the parse this wealth of data. We're doing it for free now. Is there an opportunity to connect more with analysts, to connect more data analysts with teams? Do teams need that kind of help? In other words, can you give us a job?
So first of all, I'm looking for a SQL programmer right now. If you're really good at SQL, come see me later.
Wow, there you go.
No, I'm serious.
What is that? I hope you are.
It's a database programming language. We have a big database, and it's set up in SQL. It's fine.
You didn't need to know that.
Do not rush the stage. As soon as it's done, you can see Mike later.
But yeah, I think the big problem is it's kind of, I don't know how many people were here for the last panel, but Rocco Baldelli was up here and he said, geez, a lot of the stuff that we do is kind of, you want me to go stand up on stage and talk about something and not really say anything. I'm not sure if I can do that. Somehow I've managed to do that for 6 years on this panel, but
yeah, and you
but
do it well.
You can't share stuff with other teams, and so it's really hard to employ some big open source group of people who might also work on things for other teams if they know what you're doing. We're not at an equilibrium point where all the teams know what everyone else is doing. I do think there are still some advantages that some teams have over others. There's probably some teams that know some things we don't, and we know some things other teams don't. And I don't really want some random person out there I don't know very well and have some control over their data getting access to our stuff. So it's whoever Hoopism is, I know what you're talking about, but it's hard to organize well.
I don't know how long the long term is, but I would say that in some version of the long term, those data analysts are going to become more and more important because you have to deal with the visual data. There is more data to deal with, and it's hard to deal with. You can't just get an average programmer. You got to get somebody who's pretty good to deal with that sort of thing. So I think in the long term, those spots will open up because there's.
So Dean, should they come see you for a job after the show?
Feel free.
Okay, there you go.
I'm looking for a good SQL programmer, though, just to be clear.
Yes.
Okay, I think this is probably our last question. What analytics do you use to look at college players to make draft decisions? I guess that goes to you again, Mike. And it goes on to say there are a lot of sophisticated tools in the NBA, but less so in college.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you open up ESPN Gamecast for college, you can get most of the same play-by-play data that you can for the pros. I don't know about the player tracking stuff, but yeah, any decision we're making, we're trying to get all the information we can, and there's a lot of college basketball data out there, so we'll use anything we can get our hands on. That was sort of the first thing I did when I started working for the team as an intern, was was sort of a coaching staff in transition at the time,
yeah.
And so it was easy to look at the draft and sort of not be involved as an intern because they didn't really know what was going on, and that was fine. But I think there are a lot of teams using analytics, whatever that is, to look at the draft.
But it still comes on your eyes too, though, doesn't it? I mean, I know Danny is out scouting a significant
Danny's
amount.
right now out scouting. The computer's not as good at people at recognizing all sorts of things, so you better use that information too.
But on the other hand, there's also what these numbers do exist for a lot of players going back 20 years or whatever, and they shouldn't change. Like, okay, if we had numbers from 15 years ago that projected, I don't know, actually Carlos Boozer, for instance, was a numbers kind of pick. And if you ask the right question of the computer, it says, yeah, Carlos Boozer should be taken fairly high. He wasn't necessarily taken that high. And that's the question you need to ask, is how good will this player be in the NBA? Not what's his plus minus in college, not what's his offensive rating in college. It's what is he going to be if we put him on our team.
But then I always think about, again, it's comparing players again, but players back from the earlier years in the NBA when there was no three-point shot. They didn't keep track of block shots. There were more rebounds because there were more misses. All those kind of things. So those numbers are different, I think, than today's numbers.
Don't look at data from the 50s very much.
No, right? I don't see how you could.
But there's plenty of data now.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the biggest hurdle with the draft, I think, is that you're actually looking at a pretty small sample size of information when you look at a college basketball season, especially when you throw out all the games against, the St. Leos and the Hawaii Hilos and stuff, that they play at the beginning of the season, and get to the games against quality competition. You're not looking at that many games, and with a lot of the one-and-done players, especially, they're kind of trending up like this as the season goes along, and they get more experience. Like Derrick Rose is a perfect example. His first half of his season at Memphis, if you look at the data from that, you'd be like, why should I draft this guy? And if you just isolate the second half, then you go, oh, okay, now it makes sense. So there's you don't have a ton of information actually to look at from these college players, especially since the best ones are only in college for a year.
Right. So the last question is there a such thing as a mutually beneficial trade? And I think we all agree that there is. And they'd like some recent examples that come to mind. John, why don't you take that one, because that's stuff that you plug in. Yeah?
Mutually beneficial trade? I would say if you had you took Keon Dooling into a small exception. That was a mutually beneficial trade, right? I mean, you weren't going to be doing anything else with that. You got a player for it. The Bucks got rid of a salary for a guy who wasn't going to play for him. That was a mutually beneficial trade. It was a little trade.
How about the Gallinari-Anthony trade? In some ways, wasn't that mutually beneficial for both teams, statistically and otherwise, right?
I would say that was more beneficial for Denver than New York, probably. But
see, that's a complicated one too, because there's an extension involved.
Well, and there was also Billups. There were other players involved too.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on.
But I mean, I
there.
guess in that case, both franchises. I mean, Denver's. I read somewhere something about it had a lot. They were basing a lot of it on offensive rebounding. That Anthony and Billups were better offensive rebounders, but Gallinari was a better defensive player. All these other things, and it was a lot of numbers, and all in the end was that. That's about as close to. I mean, that was a big trade.
Yeah. I mean, if you connect all the dots, Denver got like 7 rotation players out of that trade. Once you throw in like Kufos and Hamilton and Fernandez. I mean, all the guys that they ended up getting basically because of that trade. So I think they just made. It depends on your starting assumption. If you start with the assumption that Anthony was going to leave after the season and sign with the Knicks, then you got to conclude that Denver just made out like bandits.
Sure, of course.
If you start with the assumption that, that was just a game of chicken and Anthony was going to re-sign in Denver, then you end up at almost the opposite conclusion. So it kind of depends on what your initial assumption is, too.
Okay. There might be mutually harmful trades, too. I don't know. I have to think about that.
There are.
Oh, sure there are.
There are.
I can think of
we
a
don't
couple.
have time for that, Mike.
Yeah.
Hey, please a round of applause for these great panelists. All right, we're done.